The air in the grand ballroom of the Cooper estate was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco, aged scotch, and the suffocating weight of power. Michael Cooper stood at the head of the long mahogany table, his silhouette cutting a jagged line against the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the rain-swept streets of the city. He was the undisputed king of the underworld, a man whose name was whispered with a mix of reverence and terror. But tonight his eyes, usually as cold as the North Atlantic, were burning with a predatory, focused rage. At the other end of the table, trembling but standing with a spine of steel, was Lucilla Brand. The silence in the room was a living thing, clawing at the throats of the 20 capos and advisors seated between them. Lucilla could feel the sweat slicking her palms, the frantic drumming of her heart against her ribs, a rhythm that felt like a trapped bird screaming to be let out. She had come here to tell him the truth. She had come to tell him that the dizzy spells and the morning sickness weren't just stress from living in his violent orbit. She was carrying his life inside her. But Michael spoke first and his voice was a lash. "You thought you were special, Lucilla?" Michael's voice wasn't loud, but it carried to every corner of the room, dripping with a condescension that felt like acid on her skin. He didn't look at her like a lover. He looked at her like a stain on his expensive rug. "You thought that because I let you into my bed, you had a seat at this table? That you could interfere with the Brandini shipments?" "Michael, I was only trying to warn you." Lucilla's voice cracked, the sound small and pathetic in the vast gilded space. "You were trying to play at being a queen," Michael interrupted, stepping forward into the light. The gold rings on his fingers glinted, rings that had been stained with the blood of men much more powerful than the woman standing before him. "You are a distraction. A liability. You are a common girl who mistook a few nights of passion for a lifetime of protection. Look at you. You're shaking. You're weak. And in my world, weakness is a disease that I have to excise." The laughter of the men around the table was low and guttural. It was the sound of Lucilla's dignity being torn to shreds. She looked into Michael's eyes, searching for a flicker of the man who had held her hair back when she was sick, the man who had whispered that she was his peace in a world of war. But that man was gone. In his place was the boss. A monster of his own making. "I don't want to see your face again," Michael said, turning his back on her, the ultimate gesture of dismissal. "Not in this house. Not in this city. If I see you after tonight, I will treat you like any other enemy of the Cooper family. Do you understand me? You are nothing to me, Lucilla. You were a mistake I am correcting." Lucilla felt the room tilt. The secret she held, the 2 tiny heartbeats she had discovered only days prior, clenched in her gut like a cold stone. She wanted to scream it. She wanted to throw the truth in his face and watch him crumble. But as she looked at the cold, hard lines of his shoulders, she realized with a terrifying clarity, if she told him now, these children would be born into a cage. They would be weapons for him or targets for his enemies. She backed away, her heels clicking hollowly on the marble. No one stopped her. No one even looked at her. She was already a ghost. As she pushed through the heavy oak doors and stumbled into the freezing rain outside, the weight of her vulnerability crashed over her. She had no money, no family, and now a death warrant signed by the man she loved. She stood on the curb, the rain washing away her tears, her hands instinctively dropping to her still flat stomach. "I will protect you," she whispered into the dark, the neon lights of the city blurring into smears of red and blue. "I will disappear so deeply that he will never find us. You will never know his name. You will never know his blood." The scene shifts violently. 12 months later. Michael Cooper sat in that same office, but the atmosphere had changed. The air was no longer thick with triumph. It was stale with the scent of old paper and the bitterness of a man who had won the war but lost the reason for fighting. He had expanded his empire. He had crushed the Brandini family. He was the most powerful man in the tri-state area. And he was utterly hollow. A heavy, unmarked envelope sat on his desk. It had been delivered by a courier from the Vigo Syndicate, his most ruthless rivals. Michael sliced it open with a silver letter opener, expecting a demand for territory or a threat of assassination. Instead, 3 glossy photographs slid onto the mahogany surface. Michael's breath hitched. His lungs felt like they had been filled with lead. The first photo was a graining shot of a small, sun-drenched park in a town he didn't recognize. In the center of the frame was Lucilla. She looked different. Her hair was shorter, her face thinner, but she glowed with a fierce, protective light he had never seen. The second photo was a close-up. She was sitting on a bench and in her arms were two infants. The third photo was the one that broke him. It was a shot of the two children playing on a blanket. A boy and a girl. They had Lucilla's soft, expressive mouth. But their eyes, those piercing icy blue eyes that looked like the North Atlantic, were his. There was no doubt. There was no question of paternity. They were Cooper's. Attached to the back of the photo was a note in jagged, hurried handwriting. "We found your mistake, Michael. The Brandinis couldn't kill you, but these two? They make for much softer targets. The clock is ticking. We'll decide which one dies first by sunset." Michael's roar of agony and rage shook the very foundations of the house. He had spent a year convincing himself she was nothing. He had spent a year burying the memory of her tears. And all that time she had been out there alone, raising his children in the mouth of a lion. He didn't call his security. He didn't call his capos. He grabbed his coat and his .45, his mind screaming a single name. He had scolded her. He had humiliated her. He had cast her into the dark. But now the dark was coming for his children, and Michael Cooper realized he would burn the entire world to the ground just to hear her speak his name one more time. How could he have been so blind? And more importantly, could she ever forgive the man who had left her to drown? The town of Oakhaven was a place where time seemed to move with the sluggish pace of the river that snaked around its borders. It was a town of peeling paint, rusted swing sets, and people who had learned to mind their own business as a matter of survival. For Lucilla Brand it was a fortress. It was a place where she wasn't the disgraced lover of a king. She was simply Lucy, the girl who worked double shifts at the local diner and lived in a drafty cottage on the edge of the woods. Inside that cottage, the air didn't smell like Michael's expensive cologne or the metallic tang of blood. It smelled of lavender laundry detergent, slightly scorched milk and the sweet milky scent of infants. Lucilla stood at the small laminate counter, her hands shaking as she measured out formula. Her reflection in the darkened window showed a woman who had aged 10 years and 12 months. The high-fashion silk dresses had been replaced by oversized flannel shirts. The polished poise had been traded for a constant low-level vibration of anxiety. She was tired, a deep, bone-deep exhaustion that felt like it had settled into her marrow. But every time she looked toward the two cribs in the corner of the room, that exhaustion was eclipsed by a fierce, terrifying love. Leo and Mia. Leo was already showing signs of a stubborn streak that made Lucilla's heart ache. He would grip her finger with a strength that shouldn't belong to a 10-month-old, his icy blue eyes, Michael's eyes, staring at her with a precocious intensity. Mia was the light to his shadow, a giggly, soft-hearted child who reached for the world with open arms. They were perfect. They were innocent. And they were the living proof of the greatest mistake and the greatest blessing of her life. "I've got the extra diapers, Lucy," a voice called out, followed by the soft creak of the front door. Elisa Holloway stepped inside, shaking a wet umbrella. Elisa was a woman in her late 50s with hands calloused from years of gardening and eyes that had seen enough grief to recognize it in others. She had been the one to find Lucilla collapsed on the sidewalk during a snowstorm 6 months ago. She was the one who had acted as a midwife when the twins decided to arrive 3 weeks early in the middle of a power outage. "You look like you're about to fall over," Elisa said gently, placing the grocery bag on the table. She moved with a practiced ease, taking the bottle from Lucilla's hand. "Go. Sit. I'll handle the 2 a.m. feeding." "I can't, Elisa," Lucilla whispered, her voice rough. "If I stop moving I start thinking. And if I start thinking I start hearing him. His voice. It's like a ghost in this house." Elisa paused, looking at the young woman. She knew Lucilla was running from someone dangerous. You didn't move to Oakhaven with no ID and a trunk full of cash unless the devil himself was on your heels. But she never asked for names. "He's not here, honey. He's hundreds of miles away in that concrete jungle. You're safe." "Am I?" Lucilla looked at the window again. She felt a prickle on the back of her neck, a sensation she hadn't been able to shake for days. It was the feeling of being watched, the same feeling she used to get in Michael's mansion when the security cameras tracked her every move. "Sometimes I feel like I'm just waiting for the ceiling to collapse." Her deepest fear wasn't for herself. She had survived the streets before she met Michael. She could survive them again. Her fear was that the Cooper in her children's blood would eventually call out to the world. She saw it in the way Leo watched the shadows, in the way Mia commanded attention without saying a word. They were predators in the making, born to a man who saw the world as a chessboard. "I want them to be kind," Lucilla said, her voice trembling. "I want them to grow up and never know what a gun looks like. I want them to be so far away from that life that they think Mafia is just a word in a history book." "Then you keep doing what you're doing," Elisa encouraged. "You're a good mother, Lucilla. You gave up everything to give them a chance." While Lucilla fought for peace in the shadows, Michael Cooper was tearing the light out of the city. In the week since the photos had arrived, the Cooper estate had become a war room. Michael hadn't slept. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw covered in a thick layer of dark stubble. He looked less like a billionaire boss and more like a wounded animal. He paced the length of his office, the floor littered with maps, surveillance reports, and dossiers on every low-level associate who might have helped Lucilla escape. "Nothing," Michael barked, turning to his most trusted lieutenant, Arthur Corleone. Arthur was a man of few words, a veteran of 100 skirmishes, but even he looked unsettled by the raw desperation radiating from Michael. "We've checked the bus terminals, the private airfields, the fake ID rings. Whoever helped her was a professional, Michael. Or she's become one." Michael slammed his fist onto the desk, the mahogany groaning under the impact. "She wasn't a professional. She was a girl who liked poetry and painting. She was mine." The word tasted like ash in his mouth. He had claimed her, then discarded her like a piece of refuse. He remembered the look in her eyes that last night, the way the light had died in them when he called her a mistake. He had thought he was being strong. He had thought he was protecting his empire by removing a weakness. But looking at the photos of the twins, he realized he hadn't removed a weakness. He had amputated his own heart. "The Vigo Syndicate is moving, boss," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave. "They've sent a team out. They're not looking for a payout. They're looking to hurt you where you can't hit back. If they find her before we do." "They won't," Michael hissed. He picked up the photo of the twins again. He traced the line of Leo's jaw so much like his own. "I will find them. And I will kill every man, woman, and child associated with the Vigos if so much as a hair on their heads is harmed." "And what then?" Arthur asked, his gaze steady. "You find her. You bring her back. You think she's going to just fall into your arms? You publicly humiliated her. You threatened her life. You're the reason she's been living like a fugitive for a year." Michael flinched. The truth was a physical blow. He had spent his whole life building walls, making sure no one could ever get close enough to hurt him. He had succeeded so well that he had locked out the only woman who ever saw him as a man instead of a monster. "I don't care if she hates me," Michael whispered, his voice cracking with a rare, terrifying vulnerability. "I don't care if she never looks at me again. I just need them to be safe. I need to know that they're breathing." His motivation had shifted. It was no longer about ego or the Cooper legacy. It was about the crushing weight of a guilt that wouldn't let him breathe. He closed his eyes and could almost hear her laughter, the way it used to fill the cold rooms of his house. He had a secret too, one he had never told Lucilla. The night he threw her out, he had sat in his car for 4 hours outside her apartment, making sure she got inside safely. He had told himself he was just making sure the job was done. But the truth was he couldn't bear to let her out of his sight. He had been a coward. He had chosen his throne over his heart, and now the throne was crumbling. "Arthur," Michael said, his voice regaining its cold, lethal edge. "Get the jet ready. We're going to every small town within a 500-mile radius of that park in the photo. We don't stop until we find a woman who looks like she's carrying the weight of the world." The hunt was on. But as Michael prepped his weapons and his men, he didn't realize that Lucilla wasn't just a victim anymore. A year of hunger, fear, and motherhood had forged her into something far more dangerous than a mafia boss. She was a mother protecting her cubs. And in Oakhaven, as the sun began to set, a black sedan with tinted windows rolled slowly past a small cottage on the edge of the woods. The hunter wasn't the only one looking for the prize. The Silver Spoon diner was nearly empty, the 3 p.m. lull stretching out like a weary sigh. Lucilla was wiping down the counter, her movements mechanical, her eyes constantly darting toward the front window. She had tucked Leo and Mia into their playpen in the back office, a small windowless room where she could keep them under the watchful eye of the diner's owner, a gruff but kind man named Billings, first name Quint from Jaws, last name Torrance from The Shining. The bell above the door chimed, a lonely, tinny sound that made Lucilla flinch. 2 men walked in. They didn't look like the locals in their flannel shirts and muddy work boots. These men wore tailored overcoats that cost more than the diner was worth, and their eyes were as flat and lifeless as shark skin. They took a booth in the far corner, the one with the best view of both the front and back exits. Lucilla's heart performed a sickening somersault. She knew that look. It was the look of men who didn't see people, only targets. "Can I get you something?" she asked, her voice steady despite the roar of adrenaline in her ears. She approached the booth, her notepad clutched like a shield. The man on the left, a pale individual with a jagged scar running through his eyebrow, Vincent Vane, first name from Pulp Fiction, last name from Black Sails, didn't look at the menu. He looked directly at Lucilla's name tag. "We're looking for someone, Lucy," Vincent said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "A woman who doesn't belong here. A woman who took something very valuable from a very powerful man in the city." "I'm just a waitress," Lucilla replied, her pulse thundering in her fingertips. "I don't know anything about the city." Vincent smiled, a slow, predatory baring of teeth. He reached into his pocket and slid a photograph across the sticky table. It was the same photo Michael had received, the one of her in the park with the twins. "Beautiful kids. They have their father's eyes. It's a shame, really. The Vigo family doesn't like loose ends. Especially when those loose ends carry the Cooper bloodline." The world seemed to tilt. The mention of the Vigos, Michael's most vicious rivals, was a death knell. They weren't here to bring her back. They were here to erase the only thing she had left. "They're not his," Lucilla whispered, her voice cracking. "They're mine." "That's not what our boss thinks," Vincent said, standing up. The air in the diner suddenly felt freezing. "And since Michael Cooper hasn't come to claim you yet, we figured we'd take the initiative." "Where are they, Lucilla?" "Give them to us and maybe we let you live to see tomorrow." Before Lucilla could scream, before she could run for the back office where her children were sleeping, the front door of the diner burst open with such force that the glass shattered. A silhouette stood in the doorway, framed by the swirling rain and the fading afternoon light. He looked like a god of vengeance, his long charcoal coat billowing behind him. Michael Cooper had arrived. But he wasn't the cold, calculated man she had last seen in the ballroom. He was a hurricane. "Step away from her," Michael's voice boomed, a sound so primal it seemed to shake the plates on the shelves. The 2 hitmen spun around, their hands reaching for the suppressed pistols hidden beneath their coats. But Michael was faster. He moved with a lethal, practiced grace, his own weapon drawn and leveled before they could even clear their holsters. "Michael." Lucilla's voice was a ghost of a sound. He didn't look at her. His eyes were locked on Vincent Vane. "I told your boss what would happen if he touched my family. I told him I would turn his world into a graveyard." "Family," Vincent sneered, though his hand stayed frozen near his chest. "You threw her out like trash, Cooper. Everyone heard the stories. You scolded her in front of the whole council. You said she was nothing." "I lied," Michael hissed. The words hit Lucilla harder than a physical blow. "I lied." In that split second of distraction, the second hitman lunged toward Lucilla, intending to use her as a human shield. Michael didn't hesitate. 2 shots rang out, deafening in the small space. The man collapsed, his blood pooling on the linoleum. Vincent dove behind the booth, returning fire as the diner erupted into a chaotic symphony of breaking glass and screaming. "Get down!" Michael roared, throwing himself across the counter to reach Lucilla. He tackled her to the floor just as a spray of bullets shredded the pie display above their heads. For the first time in a year, Lucilla felt him. The heat of his body, the scent of expensive tobacco and gunpowder, the terrifying strength in his arms. He held her against the floor, his body shielding hers with a desperation that bordered on frantic. "The babies!" Lucilla screamed, clawing at his chest. "Michael, they're in the back. Leo and Mia. They're in the office." Michael's eyes widened, a flash of pure, unadulterated terror crossing his features at the mention of the names. Leo and Mia. He looked at the back office, then at the door where more of Vincent's men were surely waiting. "Stay here," Michael commanded, his voice trembling with an emotion he couldn't hide. "Lucilla, stay behind the steel. I'm going to get them." "No. They don't know you. You'll scare them." "I don't care if they hate me," Michael said, looking her in the eyes for the first time. The ice was gone, replaced by a raw, bleeding vulnerability. I am not letting them die because of my sins. He stood up, exposing himself to the gunfire, and began a tactical advance toward the back of the diner. Lucilla watched in horror and awe as the man who had once humiliated her, the man who had called her a mistake, now risked everything to save the children he had never met. The first major twist struck then. As Michael reached the office door, a black SUV roared into the parking lot, and a heavy-duty flashbang grenade was tossed through the shattered front window. The world turned white. Through the ringing in her ears, Lucilla heard the sound of glass shattering in the back office. The window. They weren't just attacking from the front. The Vigos had a secondary team. They were snatching the twins. "Michael!" she screamed into the blinding light. She scrambled toward the office, her hands searching through the smoke. She found Michael on one knee, his head bleeding, his hand gripping the doorframe. He was staring into the office. The room was empty. The window was broken. The playpen was overturned. "They have them," Michael whispered, the words sounding like a death sentence. "They took them." He turned to Lucilla, his face a mask of agony and fury. He reached out to touch her, but she recoiled, her eyes wide with a mixture of grief and hatred. "This is your fault," she sobbed, the words cutting deeper than any bullet. "You brought this world to us. I hid them, kept them safe. And you brought the devil to my doorstep." Michael stood up, his stature regaining that terrifying, lethal height. He didn't defend himself. He didn't scold her. He simply checked his magazine and looked toward the disappearing taillights of the SUV. "I am the devil, Lucilla," he said, his voice a low, vibrating promise of death. "And the Vigos are about to find out why you never steal from the king of the underworld. We're going to get them back. And then you can hate me for the rest of your life. But right now you're coming with me." The decision was made. The quiet life in Oakhaven was dead. The hunt for Leo and Mia had begun, and the man who had destroyed Lucilla's life was now the only man who could save her children. The silence inside the vehicle was a suffocating shroud. Michael sat in the driver's seat, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road with a terrifying, singular focus. Beside him, Lucilla was a portrait of shattered glass. Her hands were pressed against the dashboard, her breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the empty playpen. She felt the phantom weight of Leo's sturdy little body and Mia's soft, fragrant warmth. "They're terrified, Michael," she whispered, the words barely audible over the hum of the tires. "They've never been away from me. Not for a single night. They don't know anyone but me and Elisa. They're going to be crying and no one is going to hold them." Michael's jaw tightened so hard a muscle pulsed in his cheek. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. If he looked at the wreckage he had caused, he feared the rage would consume him before he could finish the job. "The Vigos aren't monsters of the mindless variety, Lucilla. They know the value of what they have. They won't hurt the children. Not yet. They're leverage. You don't break your only bargaining chip. Don't you dare talk about them like they're chips on a poker table." Lucilla screamed, turning in her seat to face him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale, but a new, dangerous fire was burning in her gaze. "They are babies. They are human beings. They are the only good thing that ever came out of the hell you call a life." Michael slammed his palm against the steering wheel, the sound like a gunshot. "Do you think I don't know that? Do you think I haven't realized that every second of the last year was a lie? I thought I was protecting the legacy. I thought I was being the boss. But I was just a fool who threw away the only two people who share my blood." He finally turned to look at her, and for a fleeting second the king of the underworld vanished. In his place was a man drowning in his own regrets. "I saw them, Lucilla. In the photo. I saw the eyes. My eyes. I didn't even know their names until 10 minutes ago, and I already feel like my heart is being ripped out through my throat. So don't tell me I don't care." The raw honesty in his voice momentarily silenced her. She looked away, staring out at the blurred trees. The tension between them wasn't just about the kidnapping. It was the unresolved ghost of their past, the memory of that ballroom floor, and the year of cold, lonely nights she had spent wondering if he ever even thought of her. "Leo," she said softly. "His name is Leo. And the girl is Mia. After your grandmother." Michael's breath hitched. He had mentioned his grandmother once, in the middle of a quiet night when the world seemed far away. He had remembered. Even after he destroyed her, she had honored his blood. The realization was a physical weight on his chest. Leo and Mia, he repeated, the name sounding foreign and sacred in his mouth. The SUV's radio crackled to life. It was Arthur Corleone, his voice steady despite the chaos. Boss, we tracked the SUV to a transfer point near the old shipyard. They switched vehicles. They're moving in 3 different directions now, 3 identical black vans. It's a shell game. Which one has the children, Arthur? Michael's voice was cold again, the professional killer taking the lead. We're not sure. But one of the vans is heading toward a safe house in the industrial district owned by a man named Enzo, first. Enzo from The Godfather, last. Doyle from The French Connection. He's a known associate of the Vigos. If I were a betting man, I'd say they're taking them there to wait for instructions. Doyle's place is a fortress, Michael muttered. He looked at Lucilla. He knew what he had to do, but the thought of putting her in further danger made his blood run cold. Yet he also knew she wouldn't stay behind. Not this time. We're going to a contact first, Michael said, swerving the SUV onto a hidden service road. I need more than just guns. I need to know exactly which room those children are in before we breach. I won't risk a stray bullet. They pulled up to a secluded, high-walled villa on the outskirts of the city. This was the home of Elena Ripley, first. Elena from Uncharted, last. Ripley from Alien, a former intelligence officer who now made a very lucrative living as a finder for the city's elite. Inside the villa, the air was cool and smelled of expensive tea and ozone from a bank of humming servers. Elena was a woman of sharp angles and even sharper intellect. She didn't blink when the most feared man in the city walked into her living room with a disheveled, grieving woman in tow. Michael, Elena said, her eyes scanning Lucilla. I heard Oakhaven went up in flames. I assume this is about the mistake you made a year ago. Lucilla flinched at the word, and Michael's hand instinctively went to the small of her back. A protective gesture he didn't even seem aware he was making. Watch your tongue, Elena. I need eyes on Enzo Doyle's compound. Thermal, satellite, whatever you have. I need to know where the children are. As Elena worked, the silence returned, heavier than before. Lucilla stood by a window, her arms wrapped around herself. Michael approached her, his movements cautious, as if he were approaching a wounded animal. Lucilla, he began, his voice low. When this is over, when we have them back. Don't, she interrupted, her voice trembling. Don't talk about when it's over. Don't talk about the future. You don't get to do that. You chose the city, Michael. You chose the power. You made your bed in this filth and you forced me to sleep in it alone. You don't get to come back a year later and act like a father. I am their father, Michael said, a spark of his old arrogance flickering. A father is the man who stays. Lucilla hissed, turning on him. A father is the man who changes the diapers at 3 a.m. because his wife is too tired to move. A father is the man who makes sure the world is safe for them. You're the reason they're in a cold room somewhere right now with a man holding a gun to their heads. You're not a father, Michael. You're a curse. The words were a direct hit. Michael stepped back, his face darkening. He wanted to argue, to tell her about the threats he had neutralized to keep her safe from a distance, to tell her how many nights he had sat in the dark staring at her picture. But he knew it didn't matter. He was right. I have them, Elena's voice cut through the tension. They crowded around the screen. A thermal heat map showed a 3-story warehouse. On the top floor, 2 small, distinct heat signatures were huddled together in a corner. There, Lucilla gasped, her finger trembling as she touched the screen. That's them. They're together. There are 12 guards on the floor, Elena pointed out. And Enzo Doyle himself is in the room below. He's waiting for the order to move them again. Michael, if you go in there with a frontal assault, they'll kill the kids before you hit the 2nd floor. I'm not going in with an assault, Michael said, his eyes narrowing as he memorized the layout. I'm going in through the vents. Arthur and the team will provide the distraction at the front gate. I'm going with you, Lucilla said. It wasn't a request. No. It's too dangerous. You stay with Elena. Lucilla walked up to him, her face inches from his. She didn't look like a waitress from a diner anymore. She looked like a woman who had survived the worst Michael Cooper could throw at her and had come out the other side made of iron. I spent a year learning how to protect those babies. I can shoot, Michael. I can move. And I am the only person in the world they won't scream at when they see a face in the dark. If you want them to be quiet, if you want them to be safe, I'm going in. Michael looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the transformation. He saw the strength he had tried to crush, now refined and weaponized. A part of him, the part that had fallen in love with her in the first place, was filled with a dark, twisted pride. Fine, Michael whispered. But you follow my lead. You do exactly what I say. Things go sideways, you take the children and you run. You don't look back for me. Do you understand? Lucilla nodded, her jaw set. As they prepared to leave, Michael checked his weapons. He handed Lucilla a small, sleek 9mm. Do you remember how to use this? I never forgot, she said, checking the safety with a practiced click that made Michael's heart skip a beat. They were a team now, bound by blood and a shared, agonizing goal. But as they drove toward the industrial district, a new obstacle appeared. Arthur's voice came over the comms again, sounding frantic. Boss, we have a problem. The Vigos aren't just holding them for leverage. I just got word from an informant. They've called a meeting of the 5 families. They're going to use the children to force you to abdicate your seat. If you don't show up at the council hall by midnight and sign over your territories, they're going to execute the Cooper heirs in front of everyone to show that your line is dead. The stakes had just doubled. It wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. It was a race against a political execution. And as the warehouse came into view, Lucilla realized that the man who had scolded her a year ago was now being forced to choose between the empire he had spent his life building and the children he had only just discovered. Michael, Lucilla said, looking at the dark silhouette of the warehouse. What are you going to do? Michael looked at the warehouse, then at the gun in his hand, then finally at her. The empire can burn, he said, his voice a low, terrifying vow. I'm getting my children. Every few feet Michael would pause, his hand signaled for silence. Through the slats of the ventilation grates, they could see the world they both hated. Below them, guards armed with submachine guns paced the concrete floors. The warehouse was a labyrinth of shipping crates and heavy machinery, a cathedral of industrial decay. Nearly there, Michael mouthed, his voice a vibration she felt more than heard. They reached a junction directly above the top-floor office. Michael unscrewed the grate with a multi-tool, his movements silent and surgical. He lowered himself onto a high-set steel catwalk, then reached back up to catch Lucilla. As her hands met his, the electrical charge between them was undeniable, a spark of the past clashing with the desperate present. For a second his grip tightened, his eyes searching hers, pleading for a forgiveness he hadn't yet earned. I have you, he whispered. She pulled away as soon as her feet hit the metal. You have the mission, Michael. Don't confuse the two. They crept toward the office window. Inside, the thermal readings had been correct. Leo and Mia were there. They weren't in cribs. They had been placed on a pile of moth-eaten moving blankets in the corner of the room. Leo was sitting up, his small face red from crying, his little fists clenched. Mia was curled beside him, sucking her thumb, her eyes wide and terrified. Standing over them was a man Lucilla didn't recognize, but Michael's entire body went rigid at the sight of him. It wasn't a Vigo soldier. It was Reagan McLean, first, Reagan from The Exorcist last, McLean from Die Hard. Reagan was Michael's oldest advisor, the man who had helped Michael's father build the Cooper Empire. He was the one who had whispered in Michael's ear for years, the one Michael called Uncle. Reagan was holding a burner phone, his face illuminated by the blue light of the screen. The meeting is set, Reagan said into the phone, his voice echoing through the thin office walls. The council is gathered. By the time Cooper realizes I'm the one who leaked the Oak Haven coordinates, he'll be dead or deposed. The Vigos get the shipping lanes and I get the seat. It's a clean trade. Lucilla felt the world drop away from beneath her. It wasn't just a rival family. It was an inside execution. And the children? The voice on the other end asked. A voice Lucilla recognized as Silvio first, Silvio from The Sopranos last, Vaughn from Jurassic Park, the head of the Vigo syndicate. They're Coopers, Reagan said with a chilling nonchalance. They're weeds. You don't leave weeds in a garden you intend to keep. Once Michael signs the papers, the twins are handled. I've already got the accident staged. Michael's reaction was terrifying. It wasn't a shout or a sudden movement. It was a total transformation. The last vestige of the man who had been grieving vanished, replaced by a cold, primordial darkness. He looked at Lucilla and the message in his eyes was clear. Cover me. Michael didn't use the door. He smashed through the office window, the glass exploding inward like a crystalline grenade. Reagan spun around, dropping the phone, his hand reaching for a pistol at his hip, but Michael was a blur of controlled violence. He tackled the older man, the two of them crashing into a desk, spilling coffee and papers across the floor. Michael! No! Reagan choked out as Michael's hands found his throat. I did it for the family. You were weak for her. You were losing your edge. Lucilla didn't wait. She leaped through the broken window, ignoring the glass cutting into her palms. She ran for the blankets. Mama! Leo shrieked, the word a jagged sob that shattered Lucilla's heart. She scooped them both up, one on each hip, her body acting as a shield. They were shaking, their little heartbeats racing against her chest. I'm here, my loves. I've got you. Mama's here. In the corner, the struggle was ending. Michael had Reagan pinned against the wall, his forearm pressed against the man's windpipe. Michael's face was inches from the traitor's. You told me she was a spy, Michael hissed, his voice a low, vibrating growl of realization. A year ago, that night at the gala. You gave me the doctored photos. You told me Lucilla was selling our routes to the Brandonis. You made me hate her. Reagan's face was turning purple, but he managed a wheezing laugh. And it worked, didn't it? You kicked her out. You became the monster we needed you to be. You were a king again, Michael. Not a lovesick boy. Michael's eyes flickered to Lucilla, who was standing by the door, clutching their children. The truth hit him like a physical blow. The scolding, the humiliation, the year of agony. It had all been a play directed by the man he trusted most. He had destroyed the only pure thing in his life based on a lie fabricated by his own uncle. I should kill you right now, Michael whispered. If you do, you'll never get out of here, Reagan gasped. My men are outside that door. The Vigos are 5 minutes away. Give me the children, sign the papers, and I'll let you and the girl walk away. That's the only deal left. Lucilla looked at Michael, her eyes wide with terror. Michael, don't listen to him. He'll kill us all anyway. Michael looked at Reagan, then at the twins. For the first time he saw Leo looking back at him. The boy wasn't crying anymore. He was watching Michael with a strange, quiet intensity. He saw his own defiance in that small face. There's no deal, Reagan, Michael said. With a sudden, brutal movement, Michael rendered Reagan unconscious with a heavy blow to the temple. He stripped the man of his weapon and his radio. He turned to Lucilla, his expression unreadable. I was a fool, he said, the words heavy with a year's worth of unspoken apologies. I let him poison my mind against the only person who ever truly loved me. I am so sorry. Sorry doesn't fix this. Lucilla cried, the adrenaline finally boiling over. We're trapped in a warehouse surrounded by men who want us dead. How do we get them out? How do we save our babies? Michael grabbed a heavy tactical vest from a locker in the office and threw it to her. Put this on. Then put the children inside the oversized cargo bags on the shelf. We're going to have to run the gauntlet. But as they prepared to move, the warehouse's PA system crackled to life. It was Silvio Vaughn's voice, cold and triumphant. Michael, I know you're in there. I know you've found your little brats. But here's the thing. Reagan was right about one thing. You've grown soft. We've rigged the support pillars of this warehouse with thermite. In 10 minutes, this whole place is going to be a crematorium. You can come out with your hands up and the children in front of you, or you can all burn together. The game-changing twist had arrived. It wasn't just a kidnapping or a coup. It was an execution by fire. Michael looked at the ceiling, then at the reinforced steel doors. They were caged. We're not going to make it, Lucilla whispered, holding the twins tighter. Michael walked over to her. He didn't care about the guards or the fire. He reached out and cupped her face, his thumb brushing away a tear. I am going to get you out of here, Lucilla. Even if I have to carry you through the flames myself. I've spent a year being a dead man. I'm not dying today. Not when I finally have a reason to live. The passion in his eyes was a different kind of fire. One that promised either salvation or total destruction. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers for a fleeting second. A silent vow of protection. I love you, he whispered, the first time those words had been spoken since the night of the betrayal. Lucilla looked at him, the man who had broken her and the man who was now her only hope. Then prove it, she said, her voice hard as diamond. Bring my children home. The stakes were at their absolute zenith. The building was a ticking time bomb, the exit was blocked by an army, and the man responsible for it all was the very person Michael had called family. Down. Get down. Michael's voice was barely a rasp as he shoved Lucilla and the children toward the floor. The floor was a patchwork of shadows and flickering orange light. Lucilla had tucked Leo and Mia into the heavy-duty tactical bags Michael had modified, the children's small faces peering out with eyes wide and glassy from the smoke. They weren't even crying anymore. They were in shock, their tiny bodies trembling so violently that Lucilla could feel the vibrations through the straps. We can't go out the way we came, Michael coughed, his face smeared with soot and blood. The heat was becoming an entity, a physical weight pressing against them. The vents act like chimneys in a fire like this. We'd be cooked alive before we reached the junction. Then where? Lucilla screamed over the growing roar of the inferno. The windows are barred and the doors are being watched. Michael looked toward the center of the warehouse, where the heavy machinery for the shipping lanes stood like rusted skeletons. The loading bay. There's a subterranean drainage system that leads to the harbor. It's narrow, it's filthy, but the thermite won't reach it. But as they moved, the second set of charges blew. Drop your weapons. A voice boomed over a megaphone, a voice that made Lucilla's heart leap. Arthur Corleone stood at the bow of the lead boat, a heavy machine gun mounted on a swivel beside him. Behind him were a dozen men in tactical gear. Michael's loyalist guard, the men who hadn't followed the traitor Reagan McLean. The harbor erupted into a symphony of controlled chaos. Arthur's men swarmed the beach, their precision a stark contrast to the thuggish brutality of the Vigo hitmen. The exchange of fire was brief and one-sided. Within minutes, the threat on the shore was neutralized. Arthur jumped from the boat, his boots splashing in the shallow water as he ran toward Lucilla. He didn't look at her gun, he looked at her face. Lucilla. Are they safe? Are the children okay? They're breathing, Arthur, she gasped, her legs finally giving out. She sank to the wet sand, the adrenaline leaving her body in a sickening rush. But Michael, he's still in there. The warehouse. The fire. Arthur reached out to help her up, his expression grim. The warehouse is gone, Lucilla. No one could have survived that collapse. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, you don't understand. He stayed. He saved us. He can't be gone. Look, a soldier shouted, pointing back toward the burning ruins on the hill. Through the thick, roiling curtain of black smoke and the skeletal remains of the warehouse walls, a figure emerged. He wasn't walking. He was stumbling, his silhouette a jagged line against the orange glow of the inferno. He was covered in soot, his clothes scorched, and one arm hung uselessly at his side. But he was moving. Michael Cooper had crawled through the drainage pipes, following the same path Lucilla had taken, dragging his shattered body through the dark by sheer, unadulterated will. Lucilla didn't wait for Arthur. She scrambled to her feet and ran toward the slope, her breath hitching in her throat. Michael saw her and stopped, his knees buckling. He fell to the ground just as she reached him. You're alive, she sobbed, pulling his head into her lap, heedless of the ashen blood. You're alive, you idiot. Michael looked up at her, his icy blue eyes bloodshot but clear. He looked past her to the 2 cargo bags Arthur's men were now carrying toward the boats. He saw a tiny hand reach out of the mesh, Leo's hand. They're safe. Michael wheezed, a ghost of a smile touching his cracked lips. They're safe, Michael. Because of you. He reached up with his good hand, his fingers trembling as he touched the side of Lucilla's face. I told you. I wouldn't let the legacy end, in the dark. Arthur arrived, his face a mask of relief. Boss, we have to move. The council meeting has already started. Silvio and Reagan are probably signing the declaration of your death as we speak. If we don't get to the city center in 20 minutes, it won't matter that you survived the fire. They'll have a legal mandate to hunt you and the children, until the end of time. Michael's expression hardened. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by the iron resolve of the king. He used Lucilla's shoulder to pull himself up, his face contorted in pain, but his stance was steady. Get the medic, Michael commanded Arthur. Patch me up. I don't need to be pretty, I just need to be able to hold a pen and a gun. He turned to Lucilla. The rain was washing the soot from his face, revealing the man she had loved and hated in equal measure. Lucilla, I'm going to end this. Not just the war but the life. I'm going to take that seat and then I'm going to burn it down so no one can ever use it to hurt us again. But I need you to trust me one last time. I don't trust the boss, Lucilla said, her voice steady. But I trust the man who stayed in that office for his children. The boat sped toward the city skyline, a streak of black against the gray harbor. Inside the cabin, a medic worked feverishly on Michael's leg and arm. Lucilla sat across from him holding Leo and Mia. The children were quiet now, sensing the shift in the air. For the first time Michael was allowed to look at them, really look at them. He reached out, his finger hovering near Mia's cheek. She didn't flinch. She watched him with wide, curious eyes. Then with a tiny, gurgling sound she grabbed his finger and held it. The great Michael Cooper, the man who had ordered executions without blinking, let out a jagged, broken breath. A single tear tracked through the soot on his cheek. I'm going to make it right, he whispered to the child. I promise. The turning point had been reached. They were no longer the prey. They were a family, battered and broken, but united by a secret strength their enemies could never understand. The betrayal of Reagan McLean and the greed of Silvio Vaughn had brought them to the brink, but it had also forced them to realize what truly mattered. Arthur, Michael said, his voice regaining its lethal authority. Contact Selena first, Selena from Batman last. Kyle? No, let's go with Selena from Veep last. Meyer from Veep? No, let's go with Selena. Batman. Wallace Braveheart. Tell her the king is coming for his crown. And tell her to have the vault records ready. We're not just going to the council to fight. We're going to expose the rot. As the lights of the city loomed closer, the plan took shape. It was a gamble, a high-stakes play that would either secure their future or lead to a public execution. But as Lucilla looked at Michael, she saw a man who had finally found something worth more than power. He saw a father. The city skyline loomed ahead, a jagged crown of glass and steel piercing through the remnants of the storm. The council's headquarters, a limestone fortress known as the Hall of Sovereigns, sat atop the highest hill, its windows glowing with a deceptive warmth. Inside, the fates of empires were decided with the stroke of a pen or the pull of a trigger. As the elevator descended, Michael leaned his head against the wall, his eyes closing. Lucilla reached out, her hand resting on his heart. The twins were asleep, oblivious to the war that had just ended. It's over, Lucilla whispered. We're going home. Not home, Michael said, opening his eyes and looking at her with a love so pure it hurt. A new beginning. Anywhere you are, that's my home. The final twist wasn't a betrayal or a death. It was the realization that the man who had once used his voice to scold her was now using it to build a world where she and their children could finally breathe. 1 year had passed since the night the Cooper Empire burned. In a small, stone-walled villa perched on the cliffs of the Amalfi Coast, a man sat on a wooden terrace, watching the turquoise waves lap against the rocks below. Michael Cooper looked different. The sharp, predatory edge of his silhouette had been softened by a linen shirt and the ease of a man who no longer had to look over his shoulder. He moved with a slight limp, a permanent souvenir of the warehouse fire, but his eyes, once like chips of ice, were now clear and calm. Behind him, the sound of rhythmic splashing and high-pitched giggles erupted from a small inflatable pool on the grass. "Leo, don't splash your sister," a voice called out. Lucilla stepped onto the terrace, carrying a tray of fresh fruit and lemonade. She had reclaimed the vibrance she'd lost in the dark years. Her hair was longer, blowing freely in the sea breeze, and her face had filled out, the hollows of fear replaced by the soft glow of peace. She was no longer a waitress in hiding or a liability in a ballroom. She was the mistress of her own life. Michael stood, catching her waist with his good arm as she passed. He pulled her into his side, his nose brushing against her temple. "They're getting faster," he murmured, nodding toward the twins. Leo was currently trying to climb out of the pool with a look of grim determination that was a mirror image of Michael's, while Mia was content to sit in the center, patting the water and laughing at the sun. "They're Coopers," Lucilla said, though the name no longer carried the weight of a blood-stained crown. They were never going to be still. The transition hadn't been easy. The first few months after leaving the city had been haunted by nightmares. Michael would wake up reaching for a gun that was no longer there. Lucilla would bolt upright at the sound of a car door slamming, convinced the Vigos had found them. They had spent weeks in a silent dance of trauma, learning how to be in the same room without the specter of the past standing between them. But slowly the healing had taken root. Michael had used the remainder of his private, untraceable wealth to establish a foundation for displaced families. A way to balance the scales for the lives his family had disrupted over the decades. He had legally changed his name, stripping away the boss, and becoming simply a man. He spent his mornings teaching Leo how to plant tomatoes and his afternoons reading to Mia. Lucilla had returned to her art. The walls of the villa were covered in her canvases, no longer the dark, fragmented pieces of her youth, but sweeping landscapes of light and color. She had found her voice not just as a mother, but as a woman who had survived the unthinkable and chosen to love anyway. "I saw a letter from Arthur Corleone in the mail today," Lucilla said, setting the tray down. Michael nodded. "He says the 5 families are still honoring the treaty. The city is quiet. Reagan McLean. Well, he won't be bothering anyone ever again. The council saw to that." "Do you miss it?" she asked, a question she asked once every few months just to be sure. "The power? The seat?" Michael turned her to face him, his hands resting on her shoulders. He looked at the twins, then back at her. "I spent my whole life thinking power was something you took from people. I thought it was the ability to make men tremble. I was wrong." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "True power is being able to sit here in the sun and know that my children are safe because I chose them over a throne. I don't miss the crown, Lucilla. I only regret that it took me so long to realize that you were the only empire I ever needed." Lucilla smiled, a tear of pure, unadulterated relief tracking down her cheek. She reached up, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck. "You're a late bloomer, Michael. But you got there eventually." The kiss they shared was long and deep, a silent vow renewed. It wasn't the desperate, frantic kiss of 2 people caught in a storm. It was the steady, anchored kiss of 2 people who had reached the shore. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold, the family of 4 gathered around the outdoor table. There were no bodyguards, no hidden cameras, no whispered threats. There was only the sound of children's laughter, the clink of silverware, and the soft murmur of a man and a woman planning a future that finally belonged to them. The Italian Mafia boss had once scolded her, believing she was a mistake. But as Michael watched Lucilla tuck a stray hair behind Mia's ear, he knew the truth. She hadn't been his mistake. She had been his salvation. And as for the twins, they weren't just his heirs. They were the bridge to a world where his name would finally stand for something other than fear. The Cooper legacy hadn't ended in the fire. It had been reborn in the light. And for the first time in his life, the king was truly at peace.